There we go. All right. So now we're going to move on to emotional labor in conservation. What is emotional labor? Emotional labor is changing feelings and expressions for a job. This is emotional regulation. Regulation of human feelings is where an individual is required to show specific emotions as part of their job. Emotional labor is rarely recognized by employers, which has resulted in this form of labor being unnoticed, but its impacts are still felt. For example, Sally just broke up with her partner, but her retail job requires her to smile at each customer as they walk in, which means she must put her sadness to the side while she does her job duties. These are called display rules. Emotional labor is enforced by display rules. Examples like smiling when someone comes in, ending the conversations with thank you, or similar rules on how not to behave when collaborators are present. The employer sets the rules, and employees regulate their own emotions using emotional labor strategies to follow these rules. When performing emotional labor, an employee has options on how to follow display rules. The first and the simplest is surface acting. In surface acting, one does not actually feel the emotion they want to portray, but rather puts on the emotional display that is required, often used when having to face difficult people, and it is found that customers can detect this inauthenticity. This approach requires monitoring of behavior throughout interactions with others to maintain contextually required emotions. For example, being required to answer the phone with, "It's a beautiful day at Consulting Incorporated. How can I assist you today?" Even when it's anything but a beautiful day. Now, I would love for you to give me an answer. What are the benefits and challenges of using this method of emotional regulation? And just go ahead and start talking. I'm not going to pick anyone. And I would like to hear from someone who's not spoken already. So Mom, Dad, Dawson, don't talk.
Craig, the first benefit I can really think of as far as displaying goes is it really just pushes an individual. It's that basic idea of, okay, get fixed or unfixated from it for a little bit. Um, I'm really interested to hear more though of the benefits with that, because more times than not, it definitely feels like it really just stalemates things, and it makes it even more challenging. It prolongs a situation.
I think that's a good point, Logan, because I think if you approach the world when you're not already surface acting, if we're more of a deep or genuine felt acting person, this can feel a little foreign. The way I always think about it is when I was a host at Passion Fish Bethesda, an upscale sushi restaurant, where on opening night, this woman who was very proud of herself came up to the host stand and said, "It's 8:45, where's my table?" I had 4 clocks in front of me. I knew exactly what time it was, but my job required that I be nice to people who are paying us money. So I had to say, "We will get you seated as shortly as possible." But in reality, I wanted to say, "I know exactly what time it is, ma'am. It is 8:30. Go sit down. We'll get to you when we can." That tension in myself caused me to have unnecessary emotional strain. That emotional strain impacted my work, it impacted my mood, and it impacted my ability to speak to others. The benefit is because some people don't care about their jobs and they don't want to do the work and they just want to have the right words to say in the right moment. Some people really care. We're going to get into those strategies in a moment. But I want to start here because this is not the wrong way to do something. It's just a way to do it. It has challenges. It has benefits. And that's something I want you to think about as we talk about these different strategies. Nothing is right. Nothing is wrong. They're just useful or not useful. All right. The next one is deep acting. Deep acting is when workers change the emotions they feel to have the required ones. Deep acting involves more effort than surface acting, as the employee is changing their internal emotions to fit the required ones. An example of this: seeing that one of the stakeholders loves her animals on her farm, a member of a conservation organization speaks to the stakeholder about their mutual love of that animal, allowing the stakeholder to feel more comfortable in discussions around policy to improve agricultural practices. Now, this is a middle step between surface and deep. Because when you're surface acting, you're just essentially saying, whatever I need to get through this. And deep acting is, I want to do this to make the customer or the collaborator or my partner to feel comfortable in having a relationship with me. Now, it requires more effort, but it does have a stronger outcome. And I would ask again, do you see any benefits or any challenges from using this specific method?
In the case that you just talked about, it sounds manipulative, but also if there's a legitimate mutual love of animals, there's a connection.
Exactly. I think I couldn't have said it better myself. It's a very thin line between authentically doing it and performatively doing it. And that's the difference between surface acting and deep acting. Surface says, I'm going to do this because I have to. Deep acting says, oh my God, I love whole field cows as well. Let's talk about their beautiful hooves or whatever. And that is, sorry, Jeremiah, it's the only thing I can think of. I think that's, has benefits in certain places. Thank you, Michelle, for that comment. I appreciate that, because I really couldn't put that better. It's about doing it accurately and doing it honestly. And honest, open communication is the thing that makes these strategies work, especially as we get to the next one, which is, click, genuine felt emotion. This does not require any change in the worker to hide what they feel. The emotion they experience is suited for the job. Now, I'm not saying that everyone can do this, and I'm not saying that everyone can not everyone can feel genuinely felt emotion. Of course they can. I'm saying in a specific context like a work setting, genuine felt emotion is the most successful tool for creating effective outcomes. For example, Kelly empathizes with the pain of losing an animal to a predator and the economic impact because she grew up on a farm. So she was able to comfort a stakeholder that lost a cow to an introduced wolf. I think I'm getting to your point there, Michelle, where we're talking about honest versus performance. So I didn't grow up on a farm. So if I went to someone and I said, that's awful that you lost your cow to an introduced wolf, but wolves are great for the environment, they're going to notice that. They're going to feel that. But if I do say, I grew up with all kinds of predators in my backyard, and I was uncomfortable once too. But as I learned to evolve myself and as I did more research into the benefits they have, I actually learned that they're really useful for my background. And I would go one step further than this example for Kelly, who's lost her cow, and go, one cow is worth $1,895 per the Colorado law. Is that worth buying another cow? Did you care about number 187 as much as you care about your daughter? Are these things equal? Are these things balanced? And some people may think that's a bit aggressive to go, hey, what you're feeling is not accurate. But we don't question our emotions. We just let them go free. And I love that. I love freedom. But to quote a line from, I can't remember who at this point, my liberty stops here and your freedom stops here. That's where we're negotiating, is this space between my liberty and your freedom. I don't want to tell you how to behave. I want you to come to that on your own. And these emotional labor strategies help people do that. But there is a bright side to all of this. Everyone talks about the downside of constantly having to change our emotions and blah, blah, blah. But not all emotional regulation is bad. And there's a bright side that needs to be included to balance out this partial picture. An intensive focus on the negative, as we learned in the previous presentation, is not helpful. The traditional intense focus on negative aspects of emotional labor has cast a shadow over the benefits. The harmful effects come from a lack of agency and autonomy in how to perform emotional labor. Expectations to show positive emotions and the effort to do so are not inherently harmful. It is the regulation strategies used to pursue them that can be harmful. For example, a leader that creates rules about how not to act with collaborators or partners. Don't do this, don't do that. The one I always get is, you can't say that in front of kids. No one wants to hear you talk about that, whatever. And it really worked out since I'm in a new career field. Number two, authenticity. Authenticity, when one's internal and external expressions are aligned, is highly prized in organizations. People want this authenticity all over the world. It is truly a universal need. It is a matter of being true to the identities that are valued in each context. Example, Adrian is trans. They have their pronouns in their email signature, making it easier for their correspondents to know what Adrian prefers. Emotional labor can bring about emotional intelligence. High emotional intelligence can regulate emotional states as it is related to a job. It's positively related to leadership and negatively related to surface acting, helping employees to perceive demands that will require them to perform emotional labor. For example, knowing that the hour before closing is the busiest time for my coworkers. Therefore, I won't send an update request during those times as to not stress my coworkers any more than they already are. This brings us to the great division that I've seen, which is people who want to get things done and people who can get them done. They usually don't agree about how those things are to be done. And if we understand that someone's working their best and pushing them is not very helpful, and our emotional intelligence tells us that if we just let them do their work and we let them do it continuously, we'll get the benefit. It may not be on our time schedule, but it will happen. This leads to the opposite of normal display rules, which are positive display rules. These rules encourage positive emotions rather than encouraging the suppression of negative emotions. These rules ask employees to show specific emotions rather than not show specific emotions. These rules are associated with lower levels of cynicism, high levels of personal efficacy, greater job satisfaction, stronger feelings of personal accomplishment, which in corporate, in organization, in community is important to build strong bonds. For example, Environment Now, an NGO that works on advocacy, asks employees to mark their availability. And if they aren't available, no one will try and interrupt them. And they've done that for 10 years. Consistency, showing something that can be beneficial to an employee rather than being something to be harmful. And lastly, emotional labor and leaders are amazing because leaders can show emotional regulation strategies that are helpful and healthy and make people more charismatic and transformational. A leader's emotional expression influences followers. The effectiveness of a leader's authenticity depends partly upon whether leaders' emotional displays are consistent with social norms and expectations. For example, CEO Leander Lacy starts every weekly staff meeting with a spotlight on a mental health challenge for discussion among the staff. It makes me, as a staff member, feel more comfortable expressing my own challenges. Now, the real reason I'm talking about this. Emotional labor in marginalized groups. Emotional labor is justice. Justice is needed to express desired emotions during interactions. To feel like I'm respected at my job, it is a requirement for me to continue working there. That is an important emotional labor practice. As long as I'm respected, I'll continue to work. A list of outcomes that justice has been found to predict is impressive and far-reaching. If I see unfair and unjust treatment by my superior on a project, I won't trust them as a coworker. Customer service jobs are ripe for psychological exploitation. Oops. Psychological exploitation and therefore injustice. Forcing a marginalized person to be the punching bag for a disgruntled partner is making them do emotional labor that they really should not be doing. And that is an emotional tax on the marginalized, as the employees are required to show certain emotions that are allowed by the organization. The agency of the employee is reduced, especially for marginalized groups. Asking a coworker to change their appearance is saying to that person, I don't like your behavior and you need to change because something about you does not meld with my reality. Marginalized groups, for example, women in the workplace, are forced to perform specific emotional performances as part of their jobs. This performance is a reproduction of their gendered positions. Women who violate these emotional norms are harshly criticized for their unprofessional behavior. Telling a woman to smile at her job may make it seem like a more pleasant place to work, calling her mean or bitchy when she's just asking for respect. There is a consistent effort for marginalized people to constantly monitor what they're doing and how they're expressing it, because certain people can't handle the reality of their feelings. Women are faced with the dilemma of either doing the emotional labor associated with expected gender roles or participating in their own subordination, possibly facing sanctions from the organization for not doing them. They're expected to place themselves in a subordinate position based on negative perceptions of emotional displays of marginalized people. There is a pressure to engage in emotional regulation based on these perceptions or risk punishment. And more specifically, emotional labor in Black and brown people is the most challenging and contradictory aspect of racialized emotional labor, in the way that Black and brown people are forced to negotiate assumptions about their emotional characteristics, constructing Black and brown people as overly emotional, overly focused on race, or being too sensitive. An example from Leander Lacy, when working at another organization, had to present to senior leadership. Before going on this trip, he went clothes shopping. And on this day, the salesperson was another Black man. When Leander said to the worker, I need an outfit that shows that I'm credible, but doesn't make me look scary, that's emotional labor. So no red and probably tans and blues. Black men, by oppressive people, are seen as more aggressive. Therefore, I have to subdue myself to make them believe me. I have to make my identity, make my humanity sellable to other people. The Black salesman said, don't worry, I know exactly what you mean. I have clothes just for Black men in your position. But the only reason that Black people must negotiate these assumptions is because of the harmful stereotypes that are based on racism, requiring Black and brown people to negotiate their emotions in response to racial microaggressions. Did you know your dad? Can I touch your hair? Why are your people so violent? Requires marginalized people to anticipate the potential reactions of their oppressors to an emotional reaction they might express. People of color are aware of the contradictions and consequences of explicitly rejecting and resisting racist structures, a conscious part of negotiating everyday microaggressions and wresting the internalization of dehumanizing racism in these spaces. For example, Alyssa, a Black coworker, knows that Mary, a non-Black coworker, will ask her about soul food for the 100th time. Alyssa is from Maine, and she can choose to correct Mary, but might suffer consequences for doing so. Alyssa must decide if her humanity is worth defending in this instance. Some Black and brown people in oppressive spaces are forced to distance themselves from the institution in order to protect themselves from the harms of racism. They know that if they encourage conversation, it could result in their feeling angrier or hurt. Their comments could potentially be dismissed or minimized. Their resistance could make the event more upsetting and more difficult. Marginalized people are aware of the time it takes to process and deal with their emotions, giving them more emotional labor to do. It becomes a calculated decision to emotionally and cognitively disengage from the conversation in order to lessen their emotional burden. Therefore, Black and brown people who do not respond openly resist and minimize the power of oppression. This non-response also carries an emotional cost. Institutional oppressive privilege creates burdens for the oppressed and Black and brown people. They must carry the extra burden of choosing between tacitly participating in their own marginalization and actively resisting racism with all the possible consequences. Now, I just said a lot. And I said all of that because this really matters to me. My life has been filled with all kinds of marginalized people, and I've had to watch them navigate their own humanity time and time and time and time again. I've had to see people literally prostrate themselves for perceived betters to make them hear them. I have been told many times that my identity is a problem, that who I am is not helpful, I'm too loud, I'm too gay, I'm too womanly. I'm tired of letting people who are oppressing others get away with it because they write the rules. People who look like me can rewrite those rules to create positive rules so that no more do we have to say, no, don't get mad at them for being racist towards you, forgive them, explain it to them, help them. No, it's on people like me to stop making others do the work that I'm too scared to do. That's what oppression teaches us. I have a right to comfort. I have a right to never be questioned. I know everything. This is also, unfortunately, a legacy of so many other things in our world. Marginalization equals shuttering out people that could help us solve problems. And I know it was helpful during the 1570s when a bunch of white people decided to go invade the rest of the world, but we don't live in that world anymore. We never should have lived in that world. It was a human disaster to begin with. And that is why I care about it a little too much. And that's why I created this presentation. Emotional labor is super important. I know that, women know that, people of color know that, marginalized people know that. You know who doesn't know that? White, cis, straight men. They don't know it. They pretend like it doesn't happen. They tell me it doesn't exist. They tell me all the time, I don't do that. I don't make people do those things. I just let people be themselves. And then I ask them, what do you mean by that? And they usually say, I don't question where they came from and I don't tell them who they are. Really, this is the basement we're talking about. And it's 2022. We don't have time. We don't have the energy. And I had a mother who raised me right. So that's, well, I don't mean to say, but I don't have the patience to comfort when they've forced that comfort, that necessary need to comfort on other people. I know I've said a lot, and I may have gotten a little bit agitated there. So feel free to say whatever you'd like. Whew. Lots of feelings. Emotions, they're great.
I mean, I guess I'll say there's a lot to say. I think everyone's just processing emotions in this.
Yeah, I know, it's a lot, it's a lot.
I think that, yeah, and I appreciate, this is a very powerful, I mean, it's clear that you love this topic. There's no question about that, just by the way that you're able to present on it so well. And so just kind of bringing it back then to conservation and the conservation space as a whole, I think there's, you know, just because of the slide we're on right now, there's also kind of like bringing in, like, what are the emotions behind the desire to have Black and brown people do this work for them, right? Or do work to solve the problem, right? So like, for instance, we think about this from very much from the Indigenous aspect, right? Like there's an expectation that Indigenous people are going to save us and how we do our work, and you know the right way to do the nature stuff because you're Indigenous, and so therefore you understand it, so please help us fix our problems. You know, and so there's this and then there's a little bit of but without acknowledging at all what has happened to Indigenous people and the impact that that's had to today. And so this idea of like, oh, you're our hero now, but you're also the same people we wanted to kill and take all your land from. And so how can you help us? And also, because we're helping you, by the way, we're also the heroes in this story, because we are the ones saving you to help us solve the problem that we caused when we killed off your people and started this whole revolution. So it's obviously it's very complex, but that was kind of where my head's spinning right now, is thinking about Indigenous people and how we treat that whole process in terms of emotional labor.
Exactly, Leander. That is where I saw it in reality, and I saw especially by my Black friends, by my Indigenous friends, by my Hispanic and Asian friends, is that they have to constantly negotiate their humanity to just be taken seriously. A good girlfriend of mine is an actor. She's very successful. She's done a lot of great work. And I was asking her, hey, do you like your job? Are you happy with the work you've done? And she kind of sighed very heavily. And I knew what the sigh meant. It means that I'm about to hear an uncomfy truth. And she goes, Greg, I'm just dancing for white people. I'm in glorified blackface. I'm not doing anything authentic to myself. I'm doing what makes money for white organizations. And that was really hard to hear, because I wasn't getting those jobs. I was, part of me was feeling selfish of like, well, if you're complaining about getting success, blah, 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 that's just as bad as telling someone, yeah, being required to behave a certain way, required to respond a certain way, is just as harmful. And it can look good from the outside, but how it feels is the important thing to discuss. If we discuss the humanity, we can do that. Actually, and I have a good point from this, from the article I got about all racialized emotional labor. A number of scholars have extended the work on gendered emotional labor to examine the dynamics of race in various social settings, and to exculpate processes of racialized emotional labor. For instance, within service organizations, where deference is an aspect of the job, Amy Wharton finds that workers of color are likely to be overrepresented in jobs that they're seen to be better suited for based on their group membership. Moreover, her work on Korean nail salon workers notes that there was an expectation on behalf of customers that Asian women would engage in specific forms of emotional performance based on the long-standing notions of Asian women as docile. That just sounds like racism to me, and they used a lot of words to say that. So that's what I've noticed, is that a lot of white people have a lot of great words that just end up being bigotry at the heart of it. And luckily, as a white trader, I can say that's not helpful. That's not useful. Using racism to justify what you think is okay, not helpful. One person one time told me, you know, you'd get a lot farther if you weren't so gay. And all I could think was, I got here. You have to deal with me. I'm doing just fine. You don't need to critique who I am for me to understand the point. I know the world isn't ready for someone like me. I don't need you to belittle me by telling me what I already know. And I'm a tiny part of marginalization. I can imagine my Black trans women friends who are told all the time they aren't women, that they aren't okay, that they're mentally deranged, that they are freaks of nature, that God hates them. All of those things lead to mass suicide, murdered and missing Indigenous women. I mean, bigotry is at the heart of all of this, and emotional labor is at one area in which racism, bigotry hide themselves very well and instantiate themselves when they don't mean anything.
Hey, Greg.
Yes.
Laying down the gauntlet on inequity from marginalization is one thing, and I understand it, and I certainly appreciate where you're coming from. But what should we be thinking about kind of in a larger context about how to make a transition to a different way of operating? And I ask that given that inequities do exist, there's got to be some thinking about tactics, approaches, and lessons and ways of making a transition. Have you given that any thought?
Yes, I have, and there's a really good example of that. Thank you for that one, Dad. Aer Lingus is a company out in Ireland that is a plane, no, airline. They're an airline, and the company used to do emotional labor training. They actually pulled back on that emotional labor training and recruited newcomers with lower qualifications, emphasized revenue generation, and reduced staff on flights. But crew members, especially new members, began hiding in the gallery to avoid passengers, no longer engaged in deep acting, and performed only perfunctory surface acting. In short, service suffered greatly. When we use institutionalized bigotry to our benefit, especially in emotional labor, service suffers greatly. And that's the point I'm taking away from this. We're not gonna be able to fix bigotry by acknowledging it, but by acknowledging it, we can take steps to reduce bigotry. And then it's not the experience that However, far from experiencing relief that robust emotional labor was no longer necessary, veteran crew members regarded this change as a direct threat to their self-image as professionals. When we take emotional labor rules and we force them on people without understanding where they're coming from, we're denying all kinds of benefits that we could get for free. And that's my purely capitalistic argument. We are reducing the capabilities of our own workers when we limit their ability to do their job. Leander gave me 3 months to create these presentations, to do the research and to do it as I needed to. He checked in with me, we had meetings about it. But at no point did he ever say, I'm expecting this, 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 and this, and if you don't have this, you're out skis. It was a conversation based in relationship and mutual respect. Michelle, I really want to, but if you've ever seen a bunch of straight white men at the front of a room and you ask them a question about emotional labor, they kind of go blank in the eyes and they don't know what you're talking about. An example of this, I was in Steamboat Springs and I was asking 2 men in their 60s, basically, how do you feel about your land? I had to ask that question 5 different ways because they didn't understand what I was asking. And they were making me do the emotional labor, right? They're saying, I don't understand your question, you have to reframe it. Instead of trying to engage with me, instead of trying to understand where I'm coming from, they're talking down to me. They're telling me that I'm wrong because my experience doesn't match their experience and I should shut up and just listen more. And part of me was like, yeah, I've heard that before from a lot of men. I don't hear that from women. I don't hear that from people of color. Don't hear that from any other marginalized group. I would also say that any queer-led, women-led, or person of color-led organization puts emotional labor as a part of their process. Leander, every week, every single staff meeting, we talk about a mental health issue. We talk about it fully. We go, what did this do to you? Why did you feel that? And that way we can connect. An example from this summer, I worked with the National Arsenal Wildlife Refuge in Denver, Colorado. They wanted to extend their outreach to marginalized people in their community. National Arsenal was a former military testing site and chemical testing site, and they kept off local communities from using it. I was tasked with finding queer people for the focus groups. Turns out the president of PFLAG Denver is also a ranger at National Arsenal, but National Arsenal had no idea they were even there. So they didn't even use the techniques they had. They didn't even use their benefit because they wanted someone else to do that labor. I'm not blaming National Arsenal. I'm not blaming the individual. I'm just saying these systems aren't created and they're not being uplifted so that people feel like they can do them. My brain kind of crapped out there, but halfway through that sentence, so apologies.
It's a question for you to kind of explore, if you wouldn't mind. So as we go to talk to conservation organizations, we're bringing a presentation about emotional labor, and they're like, okay, our number one priority is climate change. How do you connect emotional labor to climate change? Like, how do you go from one to the other?
Let's take an example that we can talk about, bat conservation in Colorado. Colorado has no natural caves, therefore bats are hard to find. But bats are really important for pollinators. They're really important for all kinds of things. The conservation organization, if they care about climate change, would have to explain to me what about climate change is so important. Saying climate change is too broad. Saying climate mitigation, too broad. You need to tell me what element of climate change you want to focus on, because when we start these massive, gigantic concepts that are not broken down into their individual counterparts, we can't do anything. And emotional labor is attached to that. For example, I was in a show back in my old life where no one knew how to do verse, like read poetry in a critical actory way. The director did not hire someone to do that. He turned to me about halfway through the process and said, "Hey, can you do this?" And I was faced with a choice. One, I could say yes and give myself a lot more work. I could say no, and the production would suffer. That's putting onto me an almost impossible choice. Conservation organizations, I've noticed, do the same thing. We want to fix climate change. Okay, what do you mean? What does that mean? That could mean anything. That could mean planting a garden. It could mean restoring a watershed. I need specifics. And if they can't give them to you, they don't understand what they're doing. For example, if someone tells me they care about diversity in their organization, and I ask them, why do you care about diversity? And their response is, there are no Black people in Utah. That's not very helpful. That's not helping me understand why you want to do what you're doing. It's helping me understand that you want to do something for weird, unknown reasons, but you're not explaining to me why. And that why is so important, because it's of the questions, it's the one we put the least into. When you look at an organization's mission statement, it is almost a conglomeration of words from a thesaurus for the same thing. We want to help people do stuff well. Great. That's not telling you what you want to do. I read one time there was this, it was the Human Rights Alliance. I can't remember. They were talking, we want people to be free to be themselves. Okay, does that mean anything? Like, that didn't mean anything to me. And you're forcing me to do emotional labor to understand where you're coming from. I have to then ask you what you, I shouldn't have to do that because I'm already being asked to do something by you having a conversation with me. You're asking me a question. Therefore, you should be prepared with all of the background. If you don't have the background, on you, darling. It's not on me. For example, Rio Grande Valley in Mexico, it got reduced 12% by the recent federal decision to reduce water flows. Do you think Mexico was included in that conversation? And do you think Mexicans who are affected by that flow were asked about if they should be given up for Denver, Arizona, and California's water usage? I don't think so. And so we're forcing brown people to do more emotional labor for a process they have no stake in. No wonder they're resistant. No wonder that they would break the rules, that they would go around it, because other people do that. And they see those examples get elevated. I don't like getting political, but when you see a politician break rules consistently, you believe you can break those rules too. That is how we learn, is watching others. Emotional labor is how we learn how other people process things. For example, Leander, you always start with, how are we feeling? That's made it seem okay for me to say, I'm feeling XYZ. And I know my coworkers will be fine with that. They won't tell me what I'm feeling is wrong. They won't tell me what I'm feeling is inappropriate. They'll just say, okay, you're feeling that. Great, feel that. And then move on. And I feel recognized, I feel heard, I feel supported.
But Greg, sometimes people and businesses don't want to do those things.
Mm-hmm.
They want to do their thing, their business activity, or their narrowly defined thing. So we have to think about, how do you make the connection between the objective that one is advocating and the narrow focus of the people that it's targeted to?
That's a very good point. No, that's a very good point. I think that's part of the fundamental problem. We need to refocus the conversation away from narrow, very specific people who have specific understandings of the world to the people who are affected. I don't want us to feel like we need to modify ourselves even more for these people as they're the ones who are creating this problem in the first place. It feels a little bit like we're saying, we get it. You didn't understand it the first time. Let's help you figure it out a little bit more. And they're not going to listen because, as you pointed out, their single track focus has made them blind to the rest of the problem. If I was in that position, I would say, okay, how do these goals go further than just your goals? And do you care about that? If they say no, then we have nothing further to discuss. And I can go to another organization that's just as interested in creating solutions, but doesn't have an ego about it. And that's what I think it comes down to, is ego. I've had experiences like that. I'm listening. Because the thing I've run across in the research, in my own personal experiences with conservation organizations, the more narrow the focus and less open to ideas they are, the less effective they are as an organization. They might tout their effectiveness, but that doesn't actually mean they are effective.
Or it takes a while to see it.
Sure.
So you can look at things like the tendency for ESG, environmental, social, and governance objectives. Companies didn't want to do that until there was regulatory requirements, until they recognized commercial advantage, until they saw a groundswell being built that would be beneficial. So I like to think about that problem as well, because getting people to buy in and having cognition, I think, is an important part of the equation.
To your point about energy reliance, about 20 years ago, about 6% of the US power grid was on solar and renewables. Now it's close to 20%. And that's not because an organization said, we're going to spearhead this thing. It's because communities were like, we're tired of wasting our energy, our money, our power on a system that's not working. And you see places like California, Arizona, Colorado itself creating massive wind and solar farms that are separate from large governments, large organizations, because they know that those groups aren't interested in actually helping them. They're interested in winning elections and making profits. The opposite example can be seen in West Virginia, where they desperately cling on to coal mining, even though it doesn't really serve them anymore economically, but it does serve them culturally. And understanding that emotional labor, that their identity is wrapped up in the industry that is in their state, would help a conservation organization make a choice to do something better. That's my own personal opinion. All right, any other comments? If not, I have stories.
I'll just add one more piece, Greg.
Yeah.
And I love hearing from other people. I don't want to be one of those people who talk too much, because I know the tactic. So what are your feelings in regards to, in essence, monetizing emotional labor? And what I mean by that is, so, we have three people, we'll call it a straight white man, a trans Black woman, and a Asian, lesbian woman, and they're all giving on a panel to talk about microaggressions in the workplace, right? Or microaggressions in conservation, whatever the case may be. Those three people should not be paid equally, in my mind, because two people are adding emotional labor that one person is not experiencing on that panel, that they have to kind of re-traumatize themselves in order to educate people of the oppressors, basically. And so what are your thoughts in regards to emotional labor and like kind of that monetizing aspect of it? Just even if you don't have a direct answer, just your feelings about it.
I think that's like one of the stickiest, thorniest issues I've come across, because that was the original problem with emotional labor. Arlie Hochschild, who in the 1980s started on flights, seeing that women stewardesses were doing 10 times the emotional labor that men were doing, but they were paid the same rate. And it was kind of insulting because the women wouldn't last as long. They had to work twice as hard to do the same amount of work as a man would do. So if that was me in that position where you have all kinds of diverse organization, kinds of people, I would have a very constructed, safe conversation with each of them going, what do you feel like your labor is worth? I'm not going to tell you what your labor is worth. I'm going to let you tell me what your labor is worth. If I am re-traumatizing you, if that is something that is happening, I want to avoid that. Like I don't want people to have to put themselves in a difficult position to make money. That's something that I personally feel. I notice in conservation organizations, they love to exploit that. They love to put up a Black person and go, explain environmental racism. And that's just not helpful because their lives are an example of environmental racism. That's not the person who should be telling it. It should be a person who benefits from environmental racism. It's from an organization that goes, we thought having lead acid battery chemicals 2 miles outside of Jackson, Mississippi was a good choice. We thought that was good because we wanted to make money. Let's take away from the oppressed and put it on the oppressor. It's not about the oppressed to make up for the oppressor's decisions. It's not up to the oppressed to make the oppressor look better. It's on the oppressor to go, wait a second, I messed up. And that's okay. Failure is okay. There is no need to like shame oneself for doing something bad. Because honestly, you call bad 30 years ago, they called it good. So I'm done with this subjective understanding of where your point is good and my point is bad. You hurt me. That's what happened. I'm hurt. My life has been altered. When I meet, my sister's a Christian. My sister is a Christian minister. She works with kids of all kinds of backgrounds. And the amount of times she's called me crying her eyes out because she's like, how did we let ourselves do this? Is healing me as a formerly traumatized person by the Christian church. Now, I don't tell her that. I can't tell her that because she gets all like, oh no, you shouldn't feel that way. I'm like, no, Tori, I need to feel these things. These are things that are helping me process. And if I was to meet a person who's talking about environmental racism and you can see it on their face. It's traumatizing to re-examine the hardest parts of our lives. I'm gonna get very vulnerable here. I tried to kill myself when I was 13 years old. And the reason I did that is not because any one person did something. It's because consistently over time, I was let down by system after system after system. And all of them told me it was my fault for feeling what I felt. That was never what they wanted to say. What they wanted to say was, you don't need to feel this because you're stronger than people who hurt you. That's what they were trying to do. They didn't succeed. I heard the message that I was the problem, take yourself out. That's how you solve the problem. And when we do that to oppressed people, when we tell them that they are responsible for their liberation, we're essentially saying, we don't care about your pain. We don't care about the thing you went through. We care about not talking about it anymore. We care about not feeling those feelings. A great example right now is Queen Elizabeth just died. I know people in my life that have all kinds of opinions about it, and I'm here for all of it. The terrible takes, the great takes, the funny ones, the not funny ones, because this is how people feel things. And rather than put limitations on them, I want them to feel like they can express themselves, like they're supported, that they're a part of my community. And I think that's why I care so much about emotional labor, is because I'm willing to do it. And I know that's like high-minded of me to be like, yeah, I can do it because I have privilege. I have been gifted the ability to do so. So let me do it. I want to have that hard conversation. I have some friends here today who I've had really hard conversations with about really difficult stuff. And because of that, our relationship is very strong. And it doesn't matter what the day-to-day ups and downs are, because I know I can trust them and they can trust me. When we have emotional labor, it's based in trust, not based in expectation, not based in standardization, but based in trust. We build relationship, we build capacity, we build resilience, we build all the things, we do it for free. We don't have to be incentivized, we don't have to be talked down to, or all of the evidence I see from terrible TikTok economists, and they always tell me that I should be grinding harder, that I should be cutting out more people from my life to only focus on my work. And this message is not helpful. It doesn't build anything. It just leaves people alone and sad. That's why we have a loneliness epidemic. Sorry, I went on a little bit of rant there. kind of good at those, but okay, I'm gonna drink some water now. Okay. Anyone who's not my mother or Leander or my father. Because I know I have a lot of people here who I care about. I'd love to hear your opinions. Thank you, Mommy. I love you. You're so cute. Okay, I guess I'll have to tell more stories then. All right, you brought it out.
Okay,
so-
I'll jump
Thank
in
you,
then
Michelle.
if you need something.
Come on, Michelle. Thank you.
So I'm struggling because I don't even know how to ask it because it's such a an issue. Is so I am embracing everything you have to say, but I know my white male counterparts, and many of them would not, they would have checked out after the first 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So so
That's my whole life.
yeah, I know. So I have, you know, I've tried to come into it and say, look, here's some compassion I'm going to grant you. We were raised in the same system. You just got a different message than I did.
Yeah.
And that sometimes will bring someone into the next step. But I mean, as a whole, I feel like conservation is not ready for what you have to say.
Well,
So
they're
I'm
ready.
glad to
Are
have
you
these
kidding
little
me?
pockets.
You're
So
not
how
ready
do
for
you
this?
navigate that?
You're so right, Michelle. That's exactly my point. Is that it's so difficult to have this conversation that I can see it on some of your faces of like, how is this going to work? How are we going to do it? It doesn't work. This isn't how our systems are created. But I think about individual examples that filter. So this is where my theory of change comes. I'm much more of a bottom up than I am a top down. I think that if you start at an organization where you make emotional labor well known, understood, and you force people to do it, or you force people to understand it, the way I've been forced to understand football like 50 billion times, eventually we grow somewhere. Do you know how many men have explained to me the rules of football? Let me tell you. My dad, my uncle, all of my male friends, all of my male friends' dads, all of their uncles, and like it is the patronizing, the talking down to this, like, oh, you would never. And I've been told to play that. I've been told to play dumb to make them feel better. Please don't insult my intelligence. To me, that says invest in women, invest in people of color, invest in alternative sources other than the ones we have. And if that means you, that means you. And if you have to say, no, Jeremy, and that is brave, that's why I speak about it in the presentation, there is real consequence to saying, I need to be heard. My own cohort mates were women. I've seen them have to negotiate saying, this is not how I want to be treated. And having to make sure that none of the men around them would hurt them either physically or emotionally for saying that. Now, we would never hurt them, but the fact they even came to that position scared the poop out of me. I was like, oh my God, okay, just even have this conversation is this difficult? So when I talked to the two lovely women I talked to from my focus group with National Arsenal Wildlife Refuge, the first thing I said is, thank you so much for doing this today. I know how hard that is. And both of them blossomed once I said that. They were like, great, he understands this is a challenge. He understands that this is not easy. He understands that I'm not just here to perform for him. I'm not my friend doing professional whiteface for white people. Like blackface for white people. It's a great point, Michelle. I mean, I'm right there with you, hon. I wish more people would be willing and open and understanding. I've had this challenge my whole life. I got told by a professor once, an undergrad, that I'll do great as a clown until I'm in my 30s. And then when I look old enough, I'll be called a king. And I never really understood why that pissed me off so much. I have now figured out why. That said that I wasn't acceptable because I looked young, because I looked like not a man. And now I look like a man, but I talk like this and I wave my arms around and people stare at me like I'm some kind of circus freak. And I usually want to go, why are you staring? Who gave you permission to stare at me like that? No, I didn't. It's the rules of society are negotiated. And unfortunately, there are certain people that have had the rule book for far too long. And I'm not saying violently oppress other people because I'm not repeating what was done to others. I'm not going to do that. But I think I've rambled a little bit there. So I'm going to let Mush do what I'm going to do.
Can I just say something, even though I've been forbidden?
You've not been forbidden. You can't talk every time, mommy. Not every time.
Okay, first of all, I want to tell you that I really love white men. Okay, I particularly love one particular white man very much. And I just think that, you know, I know that that a whole bunch of people don't feel sorry for those who are in power, but, you know, the white men who are resistant to these emotions basically were told not to have those emotions by the people who raised them. So they're kind of, you know, I kind of feel like, yes, they're responsible for their behavior, but at the same time, you know, it's like sort of blaming someone who has not been given tools. And you know, I would just, you know, I would caution you to go easy on people because they're not going to want to learn if you just say, well, you're deficient. We know you're deficient. You have the keys to the kingdom. So get out of the way because you're deficient. I mean, you know, so I think if we talk about everybody having something to contribute, I think that white men have plenty to contribute. But, you know, try to remember that they were not given the benefit of the doubt, the ones who hold the keys right now, about, you know, emotional health was not a priority to boomer parents. Yeah, to boomer parents. So, you know, and so that we're all feeling the effects of that, right? But also, I would say, and then I'll be quiet, but I think if you emphasize what the benefit is, if you just continue to emphasize the benefits of emotional connections and strengths and you know, that sort of thing, if you talk about the benefits versus who's at fault for something, and I know you wouldn't do that, Greg. I know you wouldn't be sitting there going, it's your fault, you know. But people can hear it that way. People can internalize it and say, it's not my fault. This is how I was to survive in the world. So if you can turn it and say it's a benefit to you, because it opens up all these other ways of seeing things, of experiencing things, you know, makes your life richer.
Well, that is a great point. I appreciate you bringing it up because often when I talk about these things, it's not about shame. I'm not here to shame someone and tell them they're wrong. I'm here to tell them that what they've done isn't working, and they don't want to hear that. And to your point about they were raised a certain way, it was wrong then, it's wrong now. So I'm not here to give an excuse for bad behavior. Just because someone stole something from me, they admit that it's wrong, doesn't mean they avoid accountability. And so often what we do to the people who have been privileged time and time again is give them opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to change their behavior. And what do? You're trying to take away my freedoms. You're trying to take away my livelihood. You don't care about me, none. It's based in oppression. They think they're being oppressed. They're not. They're experiencing accountability for the first time. And that's my frustration, is that I'm like, okay, I got told to be less of a faggot a lot of times. Am I supposed to now be like, okay, be less of a breeder? How does that sound? And they all get mad at me when I say that. They all go, why'd you call me a breeder? I'm like, well, being called a bunch of sticks on fire didn't help me understand the world. Why would you being reduced to your sexual identity be helpful for you? It is, I understand your point. It's a valid point, Mom. We've talked about this many times. This is an ongoing
You know how I feel about name calling.
Yeah,
name
exactly.
Calling is the circle of death. So all we're going to do is when we name call is just, you know, we're not going anywhere. We're just going.
Yes, Mom, but you have many more years of experience than I do. And
okay, that's true. I'm sorry. Let me be quiet.
No, you're not sorry. You speak your truth, and that's fine in this. And in this dancery, we're fine with that kind of hateration and holleration. All right, so that's enough for this presentation. I'm taking a half an hour to regroup myself and fill myself with water. I'll see you back at 12:30 for values and value framing. Then we'll work on to trust ecologies, and we'll finish up with marginalized people and concept. Thank you guys, it's very kind. Go have a little break. I hope to see you guys come back. If not, have a lovely day. Okay. Oh my God, I'm unmuted. I'm a mess. I'm a mess.